Antonio Rossi, the ruthless king of Liverpool's docks, and Drayton Hoxha, the cold-blooded Albanian enforcer, were about to ignite a war that would shake the UK's criminal underworld to its core. As alliances shattered and blood spilled in the streets, no one in Liverpool would escape the clash of empires. Liverpool had always been a city of contrasts. Its historic docks, once bustling with trade and opportunity, concealed a network of power and influence that few outsiders truly understood. The streets were alive with the hum of commerce during the day, but at night, shadows moved with intent. For decades, Liverpool's crime families had ruled this hidden world with a combination of fear, loyalty, and tradition. Smuggling, illegal gambling, extortion, and underground dealings were their domain, carefully managed like a delicate ecosystem that, if disturbed, could collapse with devastating consequences. The families were old, their roots deep, and their methods familiar, brutal, but predictable. But the city was about to face a force unlike any it had encountered before. Whispers began in quiet corner strangers in the pubs, unusual shipments at the docks, and men moving with precision that seemed almost unnatural. These were not the petty gangs or low-level enforcers that Liverpool's families were accustomed to. They were organized, disciplined, and ruthless, hailing from the Albanian Mafia, a syndicate whose reputation stretched across Europe. Unlike the chaotic, showy violence of the locals, the Albanians operated with a chilling efficiency, striking quickly and vanishing without a trace. At first, the Liverpool families dismissed the signs. A new player in town was not uncommon, and most outsiders had been easily absorbed into the existing hierarchy. But these newcomers did not ask for permission. They claimed territory with silent threats and financial maneuvers that undermined long-established businesses. Warehouse owners suddenly found themselves partners with unknown investors, and clubs and pubs quietly changed hands without the usual fanfare or consent. The true gravity of the situation became clear when shipments started arriving at the docks under conditions that no one could have anticipated. Crates were labeled and moved with military-like coordination, bypassing the usual middlemen who had long profited from chaos. Smugglers and dock workers alike noticed the change, though few dared speak of it. Rumors spread quickly. The Albanians were not just here to compete, they were here to dominate. Fear began to ripple through the old guard. The families who had once commanded respect and loyalty felt an unfamiliar unease. They had survived rivalries and internal betrayals for generations, but this threat was different. These were not reckless opportunists, they were strategists, planning every move with careful foresight. Any misstep could be fatal, and even small acts of defiance were met with swift, calculated retaliation. By the time Liverpool's crime families realized the scale of the incursion, the Albanians had already established networks within the city. Their influence extended beyond the docks, into nightlife, small businesses, and even legal enterprises, giving them legitimacy alongside intimidation. The stage was set for a war that would reshape the criminal landscape of Liverpool forever. In the quiet of dimly lit backrooms and shadowed alleys, the old leaders began to sense a harsh reality. The city they had ruled for decades was no longer theirs, and the newcomers were patient, methodical, and merciless. The Albanian Mafia's arrival in the UK was anything but accidental. Every move had been calculated long before a single foot touched Liverpool soil. Unlike the local crime families, who often relied on reputation and fear built over decades, the Albanians approached their expansion like a corporate takeover, blending patience with brutality. Their strategy was precise: identify weak points, secure loyal allies, and eliminate resistance before it even realized it was under attack. They arrived in small, almost invisible waves. Men in tailored suits, inconspicuous cars, and unremarkable faces filled the city streets, making the sudden power shift almost impossible to detect at first. They didn't rely on flashy displays of violence or public intimidation. Instead, They operated with a quiet efficiency, quietly consolidating businesses, offering partnerships to struggling operators, and setting up channels that could funnel massive amounts of cash without drawing attention. Every action was calculated to build dominance while remaining below the radar of both law enforcement and rival crime families. The locals quickly noticed subtle but significant changes. Clubs that had once been run by Liverpool families were suddenly managed by unknown figures who seemed untouchable and unconcerned with local politics. Warehouses were guarded with military precision, and shipments arrived on time, every time, leaving no room for interference. Even the city as street-level operators, the usual informants and middlemen, began reporting unusual activity. People who were not afraid, people who seemed to know everything before it happened. What unsettled Liverpool as traditional crime lords the most was the Albanians' willingness to eliminate threats silently and completely. There were no chaotic gunfights or public spectacles. Enemies disappeared, leaving only the chilling knowledge that they had been dealt with efficiently. Rumors spread of bodies found in industrial areas far from the city, or of associates who vanished after a single meeting. Fear, for once, was not fueled by rumor alone. It was validated by results. The Albanian Mafia also introduced methods entirely unfamiliar to Liverpool's crime families. Technology played a role in their expansion. Encrypted communications, discreet surveillance, and sophisticated money laundering operations allowed them to move vast sums of money without detection. Traditional families, relying on networks built on trust, intimidation, and visible control, struggled to understand the scale and sophistication of this new threat. Every attempt to confront or negotiate with them was met with an unexpected countermeasure, a trap or a silent withdrawal that left the locals frustrated and exposed. Even alliances with smaller gangs in Liverpool began shifting in favor of the Albanians. They were generous when it suited them, offering protection and financial incentives, creating dependence and loyalty. By the time Liverpool's crime families realized the magnitude of the operation, the Albanians had already secured a foothold in key territories, controlling access to the docks, entertainment districts, and underground operations with quiet dominance. The city, once firmly under the control of generations of local families, began to feel the subtle but undeniable shift in power. The Albanians were not there to simply coexist, they were there to rule. Liverpool, with all its history and traditions, had become the stage for a confrontation unlike anything it had ever witnessed. A battle for control was inevitable, and the locals understood that this was not a fight of brawn alone. It would require strategy, cunning, and a ruthlessness they had not yet fully encountered. The arrival of the Albanians had changed everything, and the city would never be the same. The night the first blood spilled on Liverpool's docks, the city seemed to hold its breath. For years, the docks had been neutral ground, a place where deals were made, goods exchanged, and rival families coexisted under an unspoken code. But that fragile balance shattered when the Albanian Mafia, having quietly consolidated power, decided to assert themselves openly. What had once been subtle intimidation transformed into an all-out calculated strike, signaling that their arrival was not a quiet invasion. It was a war. The confrontation began before midnight. Crates were stacked in the usual orderly fashion, workers moving about under the dim glow of dockside lamps. But something felt different. Shadows moved too deliberately. Eyes watched from corners, and unfamiliar faces lingered near the warehouses. Suddenly, the silence erupted into chaos. Firearms cracked in the darkness, echoing off the metal containers, and sparks flew as flames consumed shipments of imported goods. Explosions rocked the docks, throwing workers and gang members alike to the ground. Panic rippled through the area. The night, once a backdrop for quiet crime, became a battlefield. The Liverpool families, though seasoned and battle-hardened, had never faced an enemy so methodical. The Albanians struck with precision, targeting key enforcers, cutting off escape routes, and setting traps for those who dared retaliate. Every move seemed choreographed, every shot deliberate. Local gangs scrambled to defend territory they had controlled for decades, but their tactics felt chaotic in comparison. What had been a routine world of fear and influence became a nightmare of violence and uncertainty. Civilians were caught in the crossfire. Dock workers, delivery drivers, and late-night cleaners found themselves in the line of fire, some injured, some simply terrified witnesses to a war they had never imagined. The public exposure forced law enforcement to respond quickly, but the Albanians had planned for that as well. They left minimal evidence, vanished into side streets, and operated with a kind of discipline that frustrated police and local crime lords alike. By the time reinforcements arrived, the docks were eerily quiet, smoke rising from burning crates, as if the violence had never occurred. The true impact of the clash was not just the immediate casualties. It sent a message across the city. The Albanians were willing to use force, but only when necessary, and always with purpose. This was a different kind of threat, one that combined terror with strategy. The Liverpool families, who had long relied on fear as their currency, realized they were dealing with opponents who understood the psychology of intimidation better than anyone they had faced before. In the aftermath, the docks remained smoldering, a haunting reminder of the new order attempting to take root in Liverpool. Business owners, workers, and gang members all felt the shift. Trust eroded, paranoia spread, and alliances wavered. The Albanians had not just won a skirmish, they had rewritten the rules of engagement in the city. From that night forward, Liverpool was no longer merely a city with organized crime. It had become a war zone, a chessboard where every move carried life or death consequences, and where the shadows belonged to a new, ruthless power. Desperation began to seep into the halls of Liverpool's crime families. After the docks incident, it became painfully clear that brute force alone could not defeat the Albanians. Their enemies were organized, disciplined, and steps ahead at every turn. In response, one of the oldest families, known for cunning as much as cruelty, devised a dangerous plan: infiltration. They would plant insiders within the Albanian network, hoping to gather intelligence that could turn the tide. The operation was meticulous from the start. Young recruits with questionable loyalties were sent to mingle with Albanian associates, offering services, information, and minor assistance to gain trust. Bribed contacts, disgruntled workers, and opportunistic petty criminals were all leveraged to obtain details of shipments, safe houses, and meeting locations. Every piece of information, no matter how small, was treated as vital. Schedules were memorized, routines tracked, and contacts carefully observed. For weeks, the families watched from the shadows, feeling hope return with every scrap of intelligence. Initial results were encouraging. Police raids orchestrated using insider knowledge disrupted Albanian operations, causing confusion and temporary setbacks. Key shipments were intercepted, communication lines were intercepted, and small businesses under Albanian control suffered losses. The Liverpool families celebrated quietly, believing that the long-feared counterattack had finally begun. They felt that, for the first time, they were in control of the game. But the Albanians had anticipated infiltration with unnerving foresight. Their operations were layered with counterintelligence, and their leaders had long identified potential vulnerabilities. Every supposed ally was scrutinized, every routine checked for weaknesses. Slowly, the Liverpool spies began disappearing never found, leaving only chilling signs that they had been discovered and dealt with in ways designed to inspire fear. It became increasingly clear that the Albanians' patience and discipline far exceeded that of the local families. The supposed advantage of inside information had become a trap. Paranoia quickly replaced optimism. Trust, once a cornerstone of Liverpool's crime networks, began to crumble. Members suspected each other of betrayal, unsure who had been compromised and who remained loyal. The operation that was meant to reclaim power had inadvertently sown chaos within the families. Meetings that had once been routine turned into tense encounters, as every glance and word was scrutinized for signs of treachery. The Albanians, meanwhile, continued their expansion undisturbed. With each failed infiltration, their dominance solidified and their reputation for ruthlessness grew. Local businesses fell under their influence. Alliances shifted, and minor gangs pledged loyalty to the stronger, more disciplined force. It became clear that intelligence alone could not unseat them. Courage, strategy, and blind faith and tradition were insufficient against a force that combined brutality with meticulous planning. By the time the Liverpool families realized the full extent of their miscalculation, the Albanians had achieved a near-complete monopoly on key territories. The city was no longer simply contested. It was under the watchful, silent gaze of an enemy who could anticipate and neutralize threats before they fully materialized. For the families, the lesson was harsh. In this war, one wrong move could end everything, and the shadows now belonged to a calculating power unlike any they had ever faced. While the violent confrontations drew attention and fear, the Albanian Mafia began executing a quieter and far more dangerous phase of their plan. They understood that true power did not lie solely in controlling street corners or smuggling routes. It came from owning the legitimate face of a city. So, while Liverpool's crime families focused on recovering from recent losses, the Albanians moved silently into the world of respectable businesses. Restaurants, nightclubs, taxi companies, and small retail shops became their primary targets. Some were purchased outright using laundered money, others taken through intimidation, disguised as business negotiations. Many struggling owners, unaware of the mafia's reach, accepted offers that seemed generous at first. Low-interest loans, guaranteed protection, and promises of stability were appealing in a city struggling with economic uncertainty. But once the Albanians stepped in, the terms shifted. Payments doubled, silent partners emerged, and refusal quickly resulted in threats no legal system could protect against. Their strategy was subtle but effective. By embedding themselves into legitimate sectors, they gained influence in areas Liverpool's traditional families had ignored or never fully controlled. They infiltrated property markets, buying derelict buildings and turning them into profitable enterprises. They quietly placed their people in security companies, construction firms, and entertainment venues. Every new acquisition strengthened their roots and expanded their authority. Local crime families, who had once relied on fear, suddenly found their influence slipping through their fingers. Their usual tactics, intimidation, bribery, street-level pressure meant little against a network backed by clean paperwork and hidden investors. Even when they attempted to retaliate, they discovered the Albanians had anticipated every move. Businesses that had been considered safe havens were now secured by private guards, reinforced contracts, and surveillance systems that made direct attacks nearly impossible. The psychological impact on Liverpool's underworld was immense. The families who once walked the streets with confidence now watched as their old territories changed hands without a single shot being fired. They had always measured power in terms of violence and alliances, but the Albanians showed them a new form of control, one that didn't rely on chaos, but on structure, money, and absolute discipline. As the silent takeover spread, the public unknowingly played a role. New clubs with polished interiors, trendy restaurants, and flashy events attracted customers who had no idea who controlled the profits. Media outlets praised the sudden wave of investment, describing it as a sign of Liverpool's economic revival. Beneath those headlines, however, was a sinister truth. The city's rebirth was being funded by a criminal empire that had no intention of stopping. Even political influence began shifting. Business owners who had unknowingly fallen under Albanian control donated to local causes, attended council meetings, and built relationships with influential figures. The Albanians had firmly embedded themselves into the city's foundation. Meetings meant to be confidential were compromised before they even began. But the pattern became too consistent, too perfect. Someone was feeding information directly to the enemy. As losses mounted, suspicion spread like poison. Longtime allies exchanged uneasy glances, each wondering who among them had broken the code. When he disappeared for several days without explanation, suspicions grew into certainty. He had switched sides. But the reasons were unclear, whether it was greed, fear, or a promise of protection. What mattered now was the damage done. The Albanians used their new informant with ruthless precision. Every vulnerability of the Liverpool families was exposed, every secret route compromised, every safe house mapped. Men who had fought side by side for years now questioned whether their closest allies might also be traitors. The Albanian strategy worked even better than they had anticipated. Alliances that had held strong through decades of conflict began to fracture. Leaders who had once commanded respect found themselves isolated and unsure. Meanwhile, the traitor continued feeding information, safely sheltered by his new protectors. The Albanians had promised him security, power, and a place within their disciplined structure, things he believed the old families could never offer. His betrayal was not just the loss of one member. It was a symbol of the changing landscape. The old ways were dying, and even those raised within the traditions of Liverpool's underworld were abandoning them. As the truth settled, the families realized that their greatest threat was not the enemy across the city, but the uncertainty within their own ranks. Trust had become a luxury they could no longer afford. The betrayal marked a turning point, signaling that the war was no longer just physical. It had become psychological, invading their minds and breaking the unity that once made them strong. Liverpool's criminal empire was crumbling, and the Albanians had barely lifted a hand. Their real weapon had been fear, and it was working flawlessly. The Liverpool crime families, weakened by betrayal and constant losses, knew they had reached a point of no return. Their influence had dwindled, their alliances shattered, and their territories quietly absorbed by a rival that seemed unstoppable. Yet despite the chaos, a core group of leaders refused to accept defeat. They believed that if they didn't strike back now, the Albanian Mafia would erase them completely. What followed was a desperate attempt to reclaim their city, a final offensive forged more from pride and fear than strategy. Plans were drawn in secrecy. The remaining loyal members met in abandoned warehouses, empty pubs, and derelict apartments, moving constantly to avoid detection. They mapped out the Albania's strongholds, nightclubs, warehouses, safe houses, and transportation hubs. Each location was heavily guarded, fortified with modern security, and protected by men who followed orders without hesitation. But the Liverpool families saw no other option. Their livelihoods, their reputations, and their legacy were at stake. To gather support, they reached out to smaller gangs who had once depended on them. Some agreed, driven by memories of the old hierarchy. Others refused, unwilling to challenge a force as powerful as the Albanians. Those who joined did so cautiously, knowing the odds were stacked against them. Still, a fragile alliance formed, united not by loyalty, but by desperation. It was enough to set the final attack in motion. The offensive began on a cold, silent night. Teams moved toward key Albanian locations, hoping to strike simultaneously and overwhelm their rivals before they could respond. At first, the plan seemed to work. A few safe houses were hit successfully, and minor outposts were disrupted, but the victory was short-lived. The Albanians had anticipated the move long before it happened. Hidden surveillance, informants, and strategic planning allowed them to prepare for the confrontation with ruthless precision. As the Liverpool factions launched their attacks, they found themselves walking into traps. Entrances were rigged with alarms, escape routes blocked, and armed guards already in position. Gunfire erupted across the city, echoing through alleyways and abandoned streets. What the Liverpool families hoped would be a coordinated strike soon turned into chaotic battles, with each group fighting alone, unaware that their counterparts had already been neutralized. The Albanians responded with calculated efficiency. They didn't panic, didn't retaliate wildly. They moved like a trained force, isolating attackers, cutting communication, and dismantling each offensive unit one by one. Their intelligence network had revealed every detail of the plan, turning the family's last hope into a catastrophic failure. Within hours, the offensive collapsed. Safe houses were lost, leaders captured or forced into hiding, and entire networks dismantled. Those who survived scattered, abandoning territories they had once controlled with absolute confidence. The city that had belonged to them for generations was slipping from their grasp, faster than they could comprehend. The aftermath was devastating. Streets once known for the family's presence now lay silent under new control. The Albanians, unfazed by the attempted rebellion, strengthened their grip even further, taking the failure of the offensive as proof that their dominance was unquestionable. Liverpool had been reshaped by power, precision, and fear. For the remaining members of the old families, the defeat was more than a loss. It was the end of an era. Their final attempt to reclaim the city had instead confirmed their downfall. For the first time in decades, they faced a future where their influence no longer mattered, and the shadows they once ruled belonged to someone else. When the chaos finally settled, Liverpool was unrecognizable to those who had once controlled it. The streets that had echoed with the presence of the city's oldest crime families were now quiet, patrolled, and owned by a new order. The Albanian Mafia, relentless and precise, had emerged as the undisputed rulers. Their rise had been subtle in some areas and violent in others, but every step had been carefully calculated to ensure dominance. What remained of the old families faced a grim reality. They had lost not just territory, but identity, history, and influence. The few leaders who survived the final offensive vanished into hiding. Some fled the city entirely, abandoning everything they had built over decades. Others were forced into the shadows, existing in a world where their decisions could not carry weight and where every move had to be measured against the possibility of retribution. Many who stayed faced imprisonment or death, targeted by an enemy who had learned every lesson from previous confrontations. For these survivors, life had become a delicate balance of fear, caution, and memory. Meanwhile, the Albanians consolidated their empire quietly, embedding themselves into both the legal and illegal facets of Liverpool. Businesses that had once been symbols of the old family's power were now under new management, with profits quietly funneled into Albanian networks. Nightclubs and entertainment venues that had served as meeting points for local gangs now operated under strict surveillance, ensuring loyalty and eliminating potential threats. Even politicians and local authorities, who had long turned a blind eye to traditional crime families, found themselves facing an influence they could neither challenge nor fully understand. The psychological impact on the city's criminal underworld was profound. Fear, once a tool used by local families, was now wielded by an invader who combined patience with brutality. The old methods, intimidation, tradition, and reputation, were rendered nearly obsolete. Every former ally became a potential target or liability, and every plan had to account for an enemy who was always several steps ahead. The Albanians had not simply won battles, they had rewritten the rules entirely. For the general public, much of the change went unnoticed. The city seemed to thrive in some ways. Renovated buildings, bustling businesses, and a sense of new energy masked the truth beneath. Few realized that the prosperity they saw had been bought with coercion and fear. In quiet corners, however, the stories persisted of disappearances, of sudden wealth, and of whispers about an invisible hand controlling the city's heartbeat. Liverpool's crime families were no longer the masters of their fate. Their legacy, once a source of pride, was now a cautionary tale of hubris and miscalculation. The Albanian Mafia had proven that discipline, strategy, and a willingness to exploit weakness could overpower centuries of tradition and fear. The war was over, but the scars remained on the families, on the city, and on the memory of a world that had once been theirs. In the end, the Albanians' victory was absolute, not because they were the most violent, but because they were the smartest, most patient, and most relentless. Liverpool had been reshaped, its streets silent witnesses to the rise of a new empire. The city slept uneasy, knowing the clash of empires had ended, but the shadows now belonged to a force that would not be challenged easily. The era of the old families was gone, and in its place stood a ruthless, calculating power, claiming every corner, every business, and every fear as its own.